Good morning and welcome everyone to today's webinar on deals, deadlines and departures, navigating Brexit transition. My name is Henrietta Brealey. I'm the Director of Policy and Strategic Relationships for the Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce, and I'm joined here this morning by David Hearn, a researcher at BCU Centre for Brexit Studies, and Clare Francis, Head of Brexit Advisory at law firm Pinsent Masons. And I think it's pretty safe to say that after a summer packed full of COVID, Brexit hasn't really been top of that many businesses' agendas. However, with us now approaching that 4 months to go to the end of the Brexit transition period, we thought it was about time that we brought everyone back together to talk about what is happening and what does it mean for businesses. As you're probably well aware, the Chamber of Commerce is a not-for-profit business membership and business support organisation, and we exist to connect, support and grow local businesses. So over the next 4 months, you're going to be seeing plenty of all three of those in relation to Brexit. We're going to be helping connect businesses through peer learning opportunities to connect with other members to find out their approaches to this and learn from each other. Opportunities to connect with businesses to raise awareness of products and services that can help, and expertise on this agenda through our various comms channels. We're going to be offering lots of support, so expect to see plenty more webinars, more on those in a second. We're also delivering a wide range of accredited training through our expert international hub on key areas related to Brexit, such as customs declarations and AEO. We've also got some expert advisors who can tell you more about international trade and customs in that department as well. And we're supporting our businesses through ongoing lobbying and campaigning activity, escalating businesses' concerns, views and needs on this agenda. In fact, some of you may have received a link to our latest quarterly business report survey. If you have, please do take part, because we have some additional questions this quarter on Brexit and your business's experience, which will help us better represent you. Finally, when it comes to growth, if you're already trading internationally or think you might be interested in it, we can help you grow into new markets through a wide range of expert support and membership services, all aimed at helping you grow your business. So that's us. If any of that piques your interest, please do either drop a note in the chat or contact your relationship manager and we'll connect you up. So coming up, on the next slide, we've got a series of webinars that we'll be launching next month as part of our 3 month to go series, where our special guest experts will be commenting on everything from implications of Brexit trade deals and also UK trade on things like trade with Northern Ireland, through to what are the implications of Brexit for the services sector, an area that perhaps isn't given as much coverage in the press when it comes to this. So please do check those out on the Chamber website for further support there. But most importantly, on to today. So as I say, we're joined here by David and Clare, and we are going to be talking through what is happening when it comes to Brexit and what does it all mean for businesses. As a bit of housekeeping, please do keep your mics on mute throughout this morning's discussion. And if you have any questions, comments, reflections, pop them in the chat and I'll ask them on your behalf in the Q&A section. So without further ado, I'm going to invite our guest speakers to give us a bit of introductory comments on their particular topics. David, over to you first on, well, what is happening when it comes to Brexit?
Thank you, Henrietta. Yeah, so I wanted to begin kick off my presentation by giving a short overview of where we are today, what's the state of play as regards negotiations, what might we expect under certain scenarios going forward, and what could happen beyond January. So that's really kind of the set of topics that I want to cover. Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. Do you want to give us a quick overview of where you see those so far on what's happening with Brexit, those key elements of what's going on so far in negotiations?
So, provided I've kind of followed properly, there's a little bit of an issue going on with the muting and unmuting in Zoom. But in terms of where we are as regards negotiations, it's fairly predictable. We've come across a sort of fairly predictable set of issues that have become roadblocks for us. The major one, to my mind, is level playing field provisions, and how we get around that particular stumbling block is a major question mark in terms of negotiations. The second big issue is obviously anything like fisheries. Now, the level playing field provisions will affect anything from the question that's kind of come up recently in the press over haulage, issues around cabotage, what might be permitted, what might not be permitted. Now, the EU are only going to agree to things like that, which go naturally well beyond previous trade deals, not least by dint of the fact that the UK is geographically proximate to the EU in the way that Canada and Japan, for example, are not. So that set of issues will all be tied up with the level playing field provisions that will all be tied up around how we approach that. Fishing is the other big issue, and there I think we're going to see a bit of a to and fro. From my perspective, that's problematic. I can see that it's it's a totemic political issue, but in terms of its actual economic importance within the UK, it's very, very modest. It employs around 6,000 to 10,000 people, and you're talking about something that's worth about 0.04% of GDP. The figures for the EU are not that dissimilar. So those are sort of the two major issues that are stumbling blocks in the negotiations.
And for those who are perhaps less keen avid readers of what's happening with Brexit, do you want to explain what you mean by level playing field and what that whole agenda is?
Sure. So there's two really, really big aspects to the level playing field provisions. One is labour law, and the other is environmental protection. And there are other parts of it. I'm not suggesting that it's limited just to those two issues, but those two issues make up a large portion of what is concerning the EU around level playing field, because environmental factors, remember, affects everything from agriculture through to chemicals. It affects how you deal with, let's say, even issues like waterways. So there's a whole set of things that are bound up around that. And what we are, I think, going to look at, what I suspect will end up happening if there is an agreement in this area, is the UK will sign up to non-derogation, which means we won't go backwards. We will keep at least the safeguards that we have at present as an EU member. And the EU might similarly agree not to go backwards in terms of its environmental and labour protections. Now, the UK obviously wants maximal flexibility, or at least the UK government wants maximal flexibility in terms of alterations to labour law, in terms of alterations to environmental protection and all the rest of it. But I suspect that if you're going for an agreement, that is more or less where you'd look for a landing zone. State aid is the other kind of big issue, and there things are a lot more difficult, because the EU will want the UK to remain aligned to EU state aid rules over time, and that's obviously going to pose a problem. The government, I think, would be very, very wary, very reticent about signing up to anything that might look like we were going to continue to be bound by rules that we have ultimately no part in making. So I think there will be quite a bit of resistance to that, and there are concerns on the EU side that the UK will just attempt to bung money at companies and undercut them. So there's kind of a whole set of issues there that will need resolving. At the moment, the two sides are far apart. Whether there is a landing zone, an area where we can agree that we can find something of mutual benefit, remains to be seen.
So if the two sides are quite far apart at the moment, as you say, when it comes to negotiating priorities, what's the timeline here? I know there was a last round of negotiations that closed on Friday. There's another round starting on the 7th of September. But what's the timeline for UK and EU for needing to agree a deal here?
The time allotted is very, very short. You might remember that the UK rejected any attempt to extend the transition period. There was an option to extend the transition period by a year or two, which would take us up to the end of 2022. That was rejected. So we now need to come to some kind of agreement and have it fully ratified and in place by the end of this year. In practice, because this agreement would be a mixed agreement, in other words, it would touch areas of competence, not just of the European Union itself and all its various organs of state, but it would also touch on areas that are the prerogative of member states. The ratification process becomes complex. So you need to get that ratified, not just by the EU itself, but also by each and every member state. That means that every member state's national parliament, as relevant, will need to sign off on it. And it also means that for that to happen, in some cases, you also need regional parliaments to sign off on it. So if you follow such things relatively closely, and even if you don't, you might have seen in the news, the comprehensive agreement between the European Union and Canada was held up for quite a while, or at least the ratification was held up for quite a while by the Parliament of Wallonia, the Wallonia region in Belgium. And the reason for that was that they rejected it. They wanted better terms for themselves. And as a result, it couldn't be ratified at all. Couldn't be ratified by the European Union. So there are a host of issues. There are ways in which you might seek to get around that or ameliorate it, look to partially apply certain provisions pending ratification. But the long and short of it is the EU reckons they need at least 2 months to ratify. That means we need something that's agreed by the end of October. And that's the deadline that I think both sides are ultimately going to work towards.
So we'll be watching closely to see what is agreed around that October deadline, ready for a 31st of December end of transition. In terms of what's happening with negotiations, I think you've given us a good picture. They're ongoing. There are a few sticking points, particularly around that level playing field, state aid agendas, and a deal needs to be agreed by October. Obviously, that timeline's getting short. Is there anything that the UK government's been doing in this sort of interim period between us leaving at the end of January and where we are now to get ready for that end of Brexit transition?
There both is and there isn't. So this is where things get a little bit difficult. Obviously, everyone will remember that there were kind of frantic no deal preparations going on last year, around this time last year. They ramped up in intensity. They were stood down once an agreement was, once the UK and EU came to an agreement. So they were stood down roughly the end of October, November time frame. And after the election, things sort of went on the back burner slightly because everyone agreed they were going to have some breathing room. What has happened is that where civil servants would normally be assigned to those areas to try and ramp up preparations again, they've had to be diverted to deal with issues around COVID. So we've seen the pandemic has interfered quite a lot with government preparations. The pandemic has interfered with quite a few of those. There are also quite severe concerns at the moment about how ready we are to impose a border in the Irish Sea, which will be a necessity. The UK has already agreed to that. It is in international law. It has the force of an international treaty. The withdrawal agreement has the force of an international treaty. If the UK doesn't apply that, we are in effect breaking that element of international law. So assuming that we don't want to do that, there are concerns over how ready we're going to be to apply that. There are concerns over how businesses might be able to deal with that. There are concerns over how businesses will deal with the wider issues around EU trade as well. And it has to be a two-way thing. So there are a whole host of issues. There's also issues around movement of people. So yeah, sure, you walk out of European freedom of movement. Well, what does that do to short-term business trips to France, for example? What happens if you're in Airbus and you want to move an employee for a short time period over to Toulouse? What kind of agreements do you put in place? What do you do to facilitate that? So there's a whole host of issues that are going to crop up. There's also questions over how ready the UK is just in terms of its immigration system, because that will be a significant change in its own right. So how ready is the UK going to be to apply that? Do we have the right number of staff? Do we have all the rest of it? Then we've got questions over how ready are the French at Calais? It's no good having all the readiness in the world at Dover if at the other end of the channel, the French haven't built enough customs posts. So what do you do there? What do you do in the case of actually there's some confusion at the beginning of any no deal, or even if there is a deal, there's confusion amongst businesses. Some people fill in the forms wrong, all the rest of it. Trucks get stopped. Well, how much room do you have? Do you have enough room at Calais to deal with all of that? Do you have enough phytosanitary checking posts? Those are all the kind of questions that we're going to need answered. And at the moment, there's perhaps not as much clarity as I or you would like.
Thank you very much, David. So if I think I can summarise questions and complications when it comes to what's going on at the moment. Claire, hopefully you'll be able to enlighten us now on, well, what does that all actually mean in practical terms for businesses?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, Henrietta, and one that businesses have been trying to tackle, obviously, for some time. As we get to each of the different cliff edges, businesses have been looking at what do we need to do. Is it plan for no deal? How do I prepare? What issues should I focus on, given there are so many issues? So the good news is, obviously, some businesses have done quite a bit of that work. And we've got on the slides, I don't know if Grace can just share the slides, sort of a timeline, which is really a takeaway for you all, in terms of looking back at our previous journey, right back from when in 2017 now the Article 50 was triggered, as we've been through all the different various aspects. And really we're now on the bottom line of this. So the 1st of July was obviously the deadline by which the transition period could be extended, and it wasn't extended. So we know now that come what may, the 31st of December 2020 transition will end, and it's either a deal or a no deal, or that we're looking at that point in time. So there is more certainty than we've had in the other stages, whereas in the other stages we were always looking at, well, there'll be an extension or something else will happen. It is now almost legally impossible for there to be some other kind of extension. So that 31st of December 2020 does become a definitive date that businesses can at least plan and work towards. So flipping on to the next slide, why prepare now? I mean, as David said, we won't know what the deal looks like until October, and that being their time when they're trying to get a deal. So how do we know what we are preparing for? And businesses find it really hard to prepare without certainty. But what we have definitely seen is there is much more of a convergence now as to what no deal looks like on the one hand and what a deal might look like on the other hand. And that is closer than it has ever been in some areas. And therefore that starts to give us some real areas of emerging certainty that businesses can actually focus on and prepare for. And that has really come together because of the government softening its position from the deal being the truly ambitious free trade deal, which was going to cover everything and be like the Canada style deal, although they do tend to take 7 years or so to negotiate with the issues of ratification, as David alluded to, into something that is more pared back and focuses on some particular areas. So what are those areas of certainty that are emerging? If we can just flip to the next slide. So I'd say there are probably 3 that businesses can really focus on now. So the customs arrangements are becoming clearer. At one point in the deal hand, it would have been almost free trade, the same as we experience now. We do know there will be some tariffs and checks at the border, whichever way we go, and particularly the checks at the border. As David alluded to, there will be paperwork to fill in. Even if it's tariff-free goods, you will still have to fill in paperwork. So for businesses to upskill, to make sure they've got the resource, or they've got third-party providers that can support them in completing that paperwork correctly so that the goods don't get stuck at the border, is a really important thing, where you can start to upskill and plan and prepare for that now, where you've got cross-border trade. And certainly that's what we're seeing a lot of clients start to do, either recruit the right expertise within their business, or increase teams that deal with their rest of the world trade to have that resource and capability. And obviously the Chamber has some excellent resource to be able to help with that as well. The second area is really looking at workforce. We know we will have some kind of immigration system. So that leaves us with two key things that businesses can do. Firstly, for people in your existing workforce, existing talent you've already got within your business, making sure they have applied for settled status or pre-settled status where they're already living and working in the UK. And then secondly, thinking about how you are prepared as a business where you rely on talent or workforce from within the EU to deal with a points-based system, and to have any relevant sponsoring licenses you might need in order to ensure you can continue to access the relevant talent, or that you've taken a view of, that is going to be more complicated and a lot more costly, and have thought about different processes of how you can access talent within the local UK market in order to fill that void. And that's where we've seen some great examples of innovation where businesses have planned and prepared. So, for example, one of the hotel chains changed its shift pattern in order to have shifts that were during school hours, and therefore they could tap into a different sector of the market in terms of working mums to help fulfill that labour gap that they've envisaged coming along. And that's something that's been really successful. So I'd certainly say on the employee side, there's a great opportunity for some real innovation in terms of thinking about how you might tackle some of those challenges. And that sort of thinking, we know broadly what the employee environment is going to look like come deal or no deal, is the sort of thing that you can start planning now as business. And then finally, the other thing we're really seeing businesses start to look at is their supply chain. And actually this comes from a lot of the learnings from COVID-19, where supply chains were heavily impacted. So businesses have learned, if they have a particular weakness in that supply chain, you're sole sourcing all your parts from a company in France, for example, that company may well have been impacted by COVID-19. So companies have had a more holistic look and learned where those pinch points are. You may have even taken some steps to address those as COVID-19. So from a Brexit perspective, now is really the ideal opportunity to look at the Brexit planning you had done and take the learnings from COVID-19 around supply chain and contracts and sort of merge those two together in order to help make sure that is in place for Brexit as we go forward. So moving on to the final slide, we've just sort of given you a roundup really as a sort of checklist of what other businesses are doing, so that you can use that to start to think through things you each might do and the impact it might have on you as a business. And they range from quite major considerations. So some people are considering establishing a base in the EU, and that's particularly where they're a regulated company for some reason, or they have particular regulated products. That can be a real advantage to actually have that base in the EU that can then help comply with the regulatory regime in the EU, and your UK base for dealing with the regulators in the UK, where we get that divergence. Through to really practical issues. So we know we had a lot of exchange rate fluctuation straight after the referendum, and then as we get to each cliff edge scenario, we tend to get those exchange rate fluctuations, and just having that planning in the business of how you're going to deal with those as we go through the next set of bumpy roads is really practical and just helps with that cash flow at times when it's really tight from a COVID perspective as well. And for those of you that are in regulated industries or hold particular licenses, that is again where you can start to reach out to the regulator and understand exactly how you're going to deal and engage with them on an ongoing basis. And there's no reason that can't be done now, because the regulators do have quite a lot of certainty about how they're planning to manage that. And we'll be able to give you that steer of where you need to have an EU regulator and a UK regulator, depending on what your business is doing, and where you can just stick with the UK regulator in terms of going forward. So I think there is some positivity from a Brexit perspective there with that convergence for businesses, is that there is more certainty starting to crystallise that will really help people plan and prepare for how they want to take things forward. So I would say now is that ideal opportunity, and we're definitely seeing the vast majority of our clients start to dust down the Brexit plans they had before and just revisit them, work out if they're still solid or if there are gaps. So that sort of initial gap analysis now is a really opportune time to do it, so that you are on the absolute front foot as we start to get that more certainty when we move into the next negotiating rounds and towards the end of October, that you are really well prepared and best placed to weather that storm against your competitor group.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Claire. So in and amongst all of that uncertainty, change questions, there are those really clear areas that businesses can start looking at now. There's also on the Pinsent Mason's website, there's something called Outlaw, which is the blog post section where the lawyers post about various different things that are coming through. And I can strongly recommend keeping an eye on that for the latest developments there. We've also got up on the Chamber website live briefings now on things that we know are going to happen. So EU settlement scheme, the UK's new immigration system, something called the UK global tariff, which if you trade internationally, you should be aware of regardless, because it will apply to imports from the EU on areas where there isn't a deal. And it will also apply to imports from the rest of the world. And for some areas, you could actually find that there's a more advantageous import tariff that's been put in place as part of their reviews to get rid of nuisance tariffs and so on. So worth checking that out. And of course, the UK border operating model, which has been released, which talks about the sort of 3 phases in which the government will bring in border checks for imports from the EU, following on from the end of the transition period. So really those core areas that Claire's spoken about. As I say, those briefing papers are up on the Chamber website. So we've got a few questions now coming into the chat, so please do keep posting those there. Before I come to those though, Claire, you alluded to this already, but obviously, you know, we've been around the houses on this one before, haven't we, with deals, deadlines, no deal, deal, etc. And then, you know, businesses scramble to prepare and not a lot happens. So this time, is it really going to be different?
Well, that is a $1 million question. I mean, obviously, if we get a really good, free, comprehensive trade agreement, then it might not be that different. But we know that we're not going to be in that place by the end of this year. As David alluded to, you know, there's been a lot of resource diverted onto COVID. So the chances of that are just decreasing as we go on. I would definitely recommend prepare for those areas where we're getting that certainty, because that's where the time won't be wasted. Yes, we still need a crystal ball to know what will actually fundamentally happen, but where we're getting that certainty, I think that is time well spent right now for business.
Fantastic. David, anything to add? Is it definitely going to happen this time?
Yeah, there will be some changes. That much we know with certainty. As Claire has previously said, I can only really agree that yes, we don't know what precise changes, although we have a reasonable idea of a lot of them, but there will be checks in a way that there have not been before, and that just stems from what the UK government is asking for. In any event, I think it would be very, very difficult to get something that's so comprehensive we avoid any kind of border checks. So there will be changes. There will be changes. There is no doubt about that, and there was doubt before.
Fantastic. So there you go, 31st of December. It really is a meaningful deadline this time. So thinking about the current situation where businesses find themselves now after, you know, months of managing through COVID-19, do you think this has had an impact on businesses' ability to, and perhaps sort of willingness to prepare for Brexit? And are there any positives? I mean, Claire, you alluded to supply chains, for instance, and the greater understanding that's given businesses.
Yeah, I think in terms of the first part of your question there, Henrietta, of has it impacted on businesses' ability or desire to prepare? Certainly on their ability, because the resource has been really restrained or restricted onto other activities in the same way as the government has found that an issue. And therefore, you know, as we get back into September, lots of people are coming back off furlough, or businesses are resetting or restarting in what they're doing. Then the appetite almost to think, oh, let's turn to Brexit, is quite a challenging one. Certainly, I've got a lot of clients that say now, well, I'm not as worried about Brexit as I was, because, you know, I've survived COVID and all the disruption that threw at me with so little notice, that I feel more resilient as a business, and I feel more confident about how I can attack it now as a business. So I think that's a great positive almost to come out of COVID, of that change in mindset of what we look at, and the things they've learned from that will have stood them in good stead there. So yeah, I think it is challenging for businesses to find the right resource. Definitely, that's why I would say dig out what was done before, do the gap analysis first. A lot of what you've done before will help inform what to do now, and so there's no point reinventing the wheel in that regard.
Fantastic. And David, anything to add on impact of COVID on businesses and what that means around?
To a large extent, I'd agree. I think it has affected ability negatively for fairly obvious reasons. You know, there are also questions of cash flow. Difficult to build up buffer stocks if you have had to spend an awful lot of money dealing with the ramifications of COVID. The flip side is that a lot of businesses, as Claire has already suggested, have actually developed strategies and developed greater resilience through COVID. And as a result of that, they are better placed to deal with some of the difficulties of Brexit. And that's going to be particularly true when you're physically moving items. Where it's less true is where you're dealing with all of the other aspects of Brexit, the digital domain, questions over law, questions over, financial services, etc., etc. That will be more challenging, I think.
Fantastic, thank you. I'll have a quick look at the questions that have been posed by delegates so far. So first up, we've got one from James Roberts on, is there any possibility of seeing a partial agreement on certain areas where the two sides can agree for now, with further agreements to follow? David, do you want to come in on that one first?
Yeah, if I just kick off here, I think that's a brilliant question, and it's something that I've contemplated myself time and again. The answer is that there is no good reason why there shouldn't be mini agreements. Certainly the EU's relationship with Switzerland is made up of mini agreements. That's actually a bit of a problem because they're constantly renegotiating them. Looking at it from a slightly longer term perspective, the EU aim for this trade agreement is to have something in place that, if both sides want to, in the future can be built upon. Something that we can build upon to have closer cooperation if both sides will it. The kind of challenge is that if we don't get a trade agreement, the big challenge is political. And that is because if the two sides find that there is no area of agreement and that people get hurt, then there is going to be quite a lot of animosity. There is going to be people are going to walk away from this and feel actually that's not good, that's not nice. There'll be a public reaction both on this side of the channel and elsewhere. For France to say to their fishermen, actually the Royal Navy are going to be chasing you out of UK waters, that's not a good look, and that's not going to help with any kind of agreements. Ultimately, the two sides will need to sit down again. The two sides will have to come to some kind of agreement in a number of areas at some point. How quickly that will happen, however, that's up for question.
Brilliant. So the impetus is there. The potential is there for an agreement for now and more to follow, but still all to be confirmed depending on the next steps of negotiations. Claire, do you have anything to add on potential agreements?
No, I would definitely agree. The ability is there to do that, and you would hope common sense would prevail, and therefore we would find certain areas. But the political backdrop to that, I think, is what makes it challenging, and that's what you need to keep an eye on. There is how the politics will move us away from where we are.
Fantastic, thank you. So we've got a technical question up next, and please do post in the chat any technical questions you may have that are directly relevant to your business. We may of course need to take some of them away and find further advice for you, but we'll answer what we can here and now. So we've got a question from Mark on, with workforces becoming more remote and home-based, would working for EU companies from the UK remotely be affected? So if you've got a worker based in the UK, but they're delivering a service for an EU company, could that potentially be an area that's impacted?
Yeah, that would still be impacted. As you say, Henrietta, I'm not an employment law expert, but from a WTO perspective, there are 4 different categories of the employees, and that affects how that service provision is essentially done. So it would fall within that. So they would still see changes in the way that operates and how you can therefore engage with employees working overseas. So it's not quite as simple as having someone, working in France for you in the UK, for example. There are also tax implications when you have employees that are working overseas for you in the UK, for that individual and for you as a business, in terms of the tax implications there. So there are a few things to think through if anyone's thinking about having a remote workforce in that regard.
Could of course be more and more businesses given off the back of COVID-19 and changes to remote working there. David, anything to add on that one?
Again, I'm not an employment lawyer, but I would add that I think that will depend also depending on the specific type of business service that is being provided. So there might be ramifications in other domains, just in terms of digital, in terms of the various directives that apply at the moment. Think of audiovisual, think of a whole host of areas. Think of passporting. So there might well be business implications as well as implications for the individual, depending on whether you're employing a limited company or whether you're employing a person as a worker. So again, just a whole host of areas to think about, really.
And as a cheeky plug, we do have a webinar focusing specifically on people and skills coming in up in October, and another focusing on implications for the services sector as well. So worth keeping an eye on those. Next, we've got a question from Keith Stokes-Smith. Post the Brexit vote, the government were talking up the UK's intended increase in trade with the Commonwealth. Are the government correct to be so optimistic? And of course, you know, Commonwealth, important for us in the region at the moment with Commonwealth Games on its way. But do we think potential trade deals, increases in trade with further Commonwealth nations are potential options?
So I'll jump on this first. The Commonwealth is a huge market. It's a huge potential market. You're talking about 2.4 billion souls at the last count, or at least my last count. There are a lot of challenges in a lot of Commonwealth countries with various issues. I did some work on this looking at India and Nigeria, and there are difficulties for businesses looking to trade with either country. That's not to say it can't be done. That's not to say it shouldn't be done, and it's not to say that you shouldn't explore opportunities in those avenues. Just that trade barriers at the moment are quite substantial. Now, on the one hand, that's good. It means there's lots of scope to reduce them in the event that there's an agreement. On the other hand, there are barriers in a number of countries that even extend to kind of serious governance issues, issues like corruption, and you want to make sure that you're definitely on the right side of UK law as regards that as well. In terms of the wealthier Commonwealth states, I'd be a lot more optimistic there. With regard to Canada, obviously there's already a CETA in place, and the government will be looking to roll that over, I think, as quickly as possible. Perhaps building on it in some areas. I can see areas where you could build on CETA in the services industry, so you might open up opportunities for firms in those industries. The other kind of big prize is Australia, New Zealand. Now, in terms of tariffs, Australian tariffs are already quite low in a lot of cases. So there's some scope, but fairly minimal scope to improve on the situation there. Where you might get some kind of movement is in reducing non-tariff barriers. So there is scope for kind of greater trade in that regard. But there are the natural challenges that just come with distance. And it is, unfortunately, even in this day and age, often easier to deal with proximate markets than markets that are further afield. It's, you know, and that's just a matter of geography. There's no roll-on, roll-off ferries to Australia.
On the topic of Commonwealth nations, if anyone is interested in finding out more about trade with Commonwealth markets, I can very much recommend taking a look at the Greater Birmingham Commonwealth Chamber of Commerce, of which Keith is the president, as they offer a lot of market access information, events and guidance on how to go about bilateral trade with Commonwealth markets. And we'll of course be doing more and more in the run-up to Commonwealth Games, regardless of what Brexit does or does not bring. On to the next questions. We've got another one from Mark here. So thinking with regard to digital businesses, and David, you touched on this a bit in your last answer, where is there information to follow with regards to current Brexit planning? So I imagine this covers things like that we've spoken about briefly, things like data protection in particular, and also operating as a digital business, delivering services into a European market. Do you have anything to add on that?
Again, I'm sure Claire has some interesting comments to make, so I'll try and keep this brief. Yeah, the Information Commissioner's Office, ICO, is a useful resource. I think businesses will find that there's quite a lot there. The Chamber themselves, and we were talking about this before the event kicked off, Henrietta, the Chamber has some excellent video resources that I think businesses in any area really will find very, very useful with regard to Brexit. So I would plug that on your behalf. They are very, very good. I've watched some. Elsewhere, yeah, you'd be looking at issues around GDPR, etc. So the European Commission also have some information for firms wanting to trade with the EU.
Yeah, so from a data perspective, GDPR will remain. Unfortunately, we're not going to get rid of that. Many people thought, oh, when we're out of Europe, we don't need to worry about GDPR anymore, but that's implemented into our own laws, so we still need to be compliant with GDPR. The biggest challenge is because we're in the EU, we get automatically deemed adequate, and therefore we don't need to worry about data transferring from the UK to the EU or vice versa. When we that's continued during the transition period, but at the end of the transition period, we won't automatically have that deemed adequacy. So unless that is agreed as part of a trade deal, and it's quite a political hot potato as to whether or not they'll agree that, then we would become a rest of the world nation. So our data dealing would be the same as if you were dealing with data transfers to the US, for example, which means putting in place model clauses with suppliers or providers, or having binding corporate rules where you're doing data transfers into intra-group. So again, there is some steps you can take to start to prepare for that, and many businesses have before the previous cliff edges as well. But it is definitely one to look out for when you're in a digital business.
Fantastic, and thank you very much for the plug on our behalf, David. We do have those no deal Brexit scenario planning videos, and I can very much recommend the data protection one. We've got a fantastic case study from Susanna Lucas from Binding Site in there, talking through how her company had approached preparing for a potential end to that equivalency piece with regards to GDPR, and some really simple steps that businesses can take in there. So, unless we have any further questions from the audience, please do feel free to type those in the box as I talk. We'll move to our final question, final two questions, I should say. So what do you recommend that businesses should do next if they're looking for insight and support? Are there any key places that you recommend that businesses should go?
Obviously the Chamber website. And no, in all seriousness, the Chamber website does have a wealth of resources on there. The Chamber put together after the referendum sort of a Brexit advisory group of local businesses, which many of us sit on, and we've helped the Chamber to develop some of those resources and ensure that there are really practical steps there for you as businesses to think about, rather than it being dry or difficult to wade through. So I would advise going to check there to look for the various checklists, etc. As Henrietta said, if you're particularly interested in the legal issues, you can log on to our website. You can set up your own account and then just say which things you're interested in, and then you'll get automatic email alerts for that, and that's all free for anyone to access. So do take advantage of that if you would like to.
And David, I think there's a few things coming up from the Centre of Brexit Studies which may be of interest as well.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, we've got our annual conference, which is entitled Global Birmingham, which again, is building on some of what Keith was asking earlier. One of the things that we're kind of keen on is looking in light of Commonwealth Games, how feasible is it for us to sort of build some of those links, deepen those links, especially as we know that there are already in Birmingham a number of communities that have great links to major Commonwealth countries. So that's a focus. We're also looking at sort of how can we build a global Britain brand, if you like, for trade elsewhere, and a whole host of kind of practical Brexit related issues. So yeah, I'll plug our annual conference, of course, which this year is going to be hosted online for obvious reasons. More generally, I can only agree with Claire. The Chamber resources really are excellent, not least because actually they can help direct you to where you need to go in terms of accessing further resource. If there are unanswered questions, you will almost certainly find out where you can go to try and find some of the answers, even if your question isn't answered directly. And a lot of questions will be answered directly. There's some great case studies. I think Henrietta talked about one. There are others. So that's really good. It's really good to see what other people are doing and what other people have already done. So yeah, I would just kind of push that resource. I'd also look at the government website, although that can be a little bit impenetrable at times and in places, unless you know where you need to go. That's not always so easy. But yeah, that's another good resource.
Fantastic. Well, since you've done such a wonderful job, both of you, of plugging Chamber resources, I won't give those a plug, but I will also mention that the GBS LEP Growth Hub do have Brexit advisors on hand. So they are another great source of advice and guidance as well. But particularly businesses who are thinking about what changes around the border, around documentation and customs, all of that sort of thing. If you've got really detailed questions about those, that is very much one of the key areas of expertise for the Chamber. I think our export documentation team have over 50 years of experience between them. So if they don't know the answer to technical questions around things like commodity codes and documentation, then no one will. So all well worth getting in touch with them. We've got one more question in the chat before I go to the final question, which is, in terms of regional economic development funding provided by the EU, the UK government has talked about establishing a UK Shared Prosperity Fund. Is there any progress on that? This one comes up perennially, the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. Where is it? What's it doing? What's it about? But do you have any more insight into how far along that one's got now?
I wish, is the long and short of it. I think, as with a number of things, there's been holdups that are COVID related. That's obviously put back planning for a whole host of areas quite significantly. So the government's sort of levelling up agenda, to use their jargon, is still very much on the cards. It is still very much something that they're keen on. It's something they're keen on regionally. I know there are a number of initiatives around things like free ports. So again, it's probably a question of watch this space. We've sort of submitted to that particular question once. Sorry, excuse me, there's noise in the background. There's also questions over, when might we see this? And at the moment, we just don't know. I'm sorry to be so negative, but we just don't know. So there's been only modest progress on this, I think.
One more of those areas with question marks remaining as we get onto the countdown to the end of the Brexit transition period. Well, thank you both so much for a really wide-ranging and practical discussion on everything from the challenges of negotiations to the key steps that businesses need to take. If I can ask you to leave our audience with just one more answer, and that is, if you could give businesses just one piece of advice on getting ready for the end of the transition period, what would it be?
That's a killer question. That's why David and I both pretend we can't get off mute. I think it really depends which industry and sector you're in, but probably my sort of generic advice would be to be pragmatic. You cannot do everything. You cannot cross every I and cross every T and dot every I even. And therefore, I think it's working out what is the thing that's probably going to be the biggest hit on your business and focusing on that. If you try and do everything, you just won't get there, or you won't get the certainty soon enough to be able to do it all. So focus on that one or two big things that matter. So if you're a people business, definitely focus on the workforce. If you're in manufacturing, focus on the customs and how you're going to get things across the border, or have additional stock to weather that storm. So I think it's working out what is that one big thing and being pragmatic about how you tackle it.
Fantastic. So find those key big things that are going to be of biggest impact to your business and really focus in on those. David, over to you.
Risk management would be my watchword. Brexit is a risk, and no deal is a risk. What a deal might look like is a risk. They all look slightly different. But you can manage risk. As businesses, you will be well aware of how you manage risk and look at how you do that elsewhere and apply those lessons to Brexit. That would be mine.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both very much for joining us this morning and sharing your expertise. It has been an incredibly useful discussion from my side, and I'm sure our audience would agree. And thank you all to our delegates for joining us this morning. As I say, I know Brexit isn't quite top of the agenda for most businesses at the moment, with more pressing concerns in play around COVID-19. But of course, it is an agenda that will continue to ramp up over the coming months. So please do keep in touch through Chamber website, through our Chamber newsletters, and through your relationship managers. And we'll be doing plenty more of this kind of thing to share expertise, advice, guidance, peer learning over the next 4 months. Without further ado, thank you very much for joining us, and hope to see you at a future webinar soon.
Thanks, Henrietta.
Thank you.